This is CUNY TV, the television station of the greatest urban university in the world.
As the sun sets at the end of a New York workday, the mind transitions from daily tasks to the cloudier, more philosophical regions of social issues, culture, and politics. In a democracy, every perspective on the world is important, and people in art and culture have surprising bodies of knowledge that can shed fresh light on today's reality. The following conversations with children's book illustrator, artist, and writer Christopher Myers and artist Summer Wheat took place at that time of the day.
Christopher Myers is a children's book illustrator, artist, and writer. His work often draws inspiration from encounters between world cultures and peoples. Recent projects on the dancer Nijinsky and the ballet Firebird examined racial and sexual fluidity as catalysts for personal and social transformation. The recent show at Fort Gainsford, these banner applique paintings, I understand those are based on sort of like African flags, but they're futuristic, they're kind of fantasy, right?
Well, I'm interested in cultural forms that really are collisions of other cultural forms. Mm-hmm. So in Ghana, the Fan people make these Asafo flags, which are hybridized already, right? So they saw the British coming in with their pomp and pageantry, and they said, well, if this is clearly an important kind of magic for you, let us take that, syncretize it. And so the early ones have the Union Jack in the upper left-hand corner, and later ones, after Ghana's independent, have the Black Star. And I'm interested in the idea that our symbols, our signs, are just as much magic sigils as anything else, and they represent even the tiniest nations, you know, the nation of a moment, the nation of a myth that somehow is carried with us.
The idea, though, of something sensual, tactile that you can hold and carry around, and, you know, it seems to me sort of a return to some sort of humanism or something. Is that part of the idea?
Absolutely. I mean, there's also, for me, a question of audience in terms of wanting work that speaks to all the contexts in which I live. I tend to live in the Venn diagram of myself is pretty intricate, and I want to make work that translates. I want to make work that speaks to my grandfather, who was a laborer in Harlem, as well as it speaks to my contemporaries or other theorists or writers, to kind of carry that wide swath of people. I think that objects still have a strong weight.
It used to be like a bad word, universalizing or universalism, but now it seems to me, at least in the way you treat that you're finding commonalities between people and cultures, and you're finding wisdom maybe from the past.
There are two kind of rhetorics of hybridity. One rhetoric reifies the constituent parts and says that these parts were pure and distinct, and I think that's a very Eurocentric, phallocentric, ovocentrics notion, because what I'm interested in is tracing syncretisms. So the fact that we have long been looking at each other culturally across generational divides or across cultural divides, and so much of work is thinking about the rest of the world. You know, oftentimes when people in my other world, like kind of a literary world, when you talk about the inclusion of other kinds of writers, other traditions of writing in the canon, people think of it as displacing an earlier, purer notion. And I'm interested in bringing to the fore some of that syncretism from both sides of the abyss.
There's this idea in academia of like purism or something that I think is never been there. And even in modernism, the separation of the media and no influence whatsoever on each other. But that, you know, as modernism is being rewritten, everyone's looking at these kinds of cross-pollinations and things like that. In fact, the world has always been messier than we want to think of it.
Of course, and I like the mess, and in general, I live in the mess. I mean, it's as if, you know, if you can't see the idea that with each successive leap in photographic technology, there's a leap in painting, and painting changes because it's the 1840s. All of a sudden we have the daguerreotype, and that has changed painting. Then as photography becomes more easily reproducible, painting changes even further. And all of our kind of image vocabularies are interdependent. And I think that for me, mimics the interdependence of racial categories and gender categories and all of the kind of the messes that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be so much widespread anxiety at the moment, and it's showing up in politics globally about sort of the world order changing or breaking down. But in fact, it could be seen as a very interesting and sort of exciting like global melting pot in a way. If it wasn't causing so much problems, everyone maybe could just calm down a little bit.
This is the time of the death rattle of authenticity, the death rattle of linear narratives of self, the death rattle of nation even, the ways in which that fictional home becomes ever more important for people who don't have physical homes.
I know you've thought about Nijinsky, the dancer, Russian dancer. He lost his mind at one point, but as it's been described, as I think you described it somewhere, he basically couldn't distinguish between himself, his real self, and fantasy, or his gender, or his nationality, or racial complexion. He basically lost his mind in a kind of like soup of confusion over identity.
What struck me is that here are these diaries written, right around World War I, 1917 or so, and his anxieties are these hyper-modern anxieties, these almost contemporary anxieties of racial tension, sexuality, language issues, and you kind of go back to the history and realize that here he is a colonial subject, as a Polish person in the Russian system, as happens in so many colonial societies. The talented folks are brought into the metropole, and the tensions that he has are very precisely these tensions around the lack of linearity of his own narrative. He has problems with the church, problems with his body, problems with, which all seem wildly contemporary, but again, they're written in 1970.
And interestingly, I mean, just as he would use his body to express a lot of these, he invented modern dance to express a lot of these ideas through his body performing, that he ends up being mentally or biographically, exactly that sort of problem in print.
The same things that made him a genius, all of these things that were about how forward-looking he was as an artist, also were the things that plagued him as an individual trying to fit in within the society.
Well, there's a kind of romantic stereotype of artists, going crazy, the Vincent van Gogh thing, but I think what maybe we're really describing is like very sensitive people who are adventuresome in their thoughts and in their actions, perhaps, who end up sort of like running aground with that current society that they live in. I think it's actually more of like a private behavioral sort of thing even than just a mental.
Absolutely. And what was odd to me, what was fascinating to me, is to take the images that I created based on his diary to traditional shadow puppet makers in Indonesia and the ways in which they related to those images. There also is a tension about war and guns in Indonesia. These are people who are 3 generations of an artist, of a kind of artist, but they also suffer from the same maladies of modernity that Nijinsky was suffering from.
Yeah, no, maladies of modernity is exactly kind of what's going on globally right now too. If you think about how certain like communist countries were stunted, or third world countries, were held back, and now everybody's kind of joining the economic, technological world, and it's creating lots of havoc in their systems of living. Yeah.
I mean, one of the odd things about the American political situation, which is consistent with the way that Americans view ourselves, is that there is this exceptionalism, right? It's as if they can't see the deeply interconnected roots of our problems with, the Philippines, or with all of my friends in Kenya and Sudan say, oh no, you've got an African leader now, so it's been really good. You've got someone who's full of bombast and rhetoric and false nostalgia. That's a global phenomenon, and we are as interconnected in that same way. We are still kind of recovering from the mid-90s identity politics, is that it does turn us all to looking inward.
Our freedoms, our indulgence in finding who we are, I think which even accelerated in the 70s in this sort of, and that decade, the me decade, has made people sort of detached from each other. And I don't know if there's any escaping identity politics or getting around that at this point. I mean,
Right.
can a woman actually run for president and seriously win right now? Because it's just symbolically not something a lot of people can choose. Is that
Right. I mean, and I don't think that I would like to escape fully identity politics.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I identify in so many ways. One of the things that I'm interested in is the ways in which identity politics could have been thought of as an interlacing of identities, because
Unifying.
no one stands in one identity position ever.
Right.
And that's why when you see, especially the identities that are harder to define, class being one of the main ones, people don't identify it so loudly. Like if you stand in a room of 100 people and you say, who here is middle class, 99 will step forward. Very few people identify as either wealthy or poor.
I think what you do with children's books is very interesting as a very kind of traditional thing. It kind of carries the torch of Western civilization in a way. But it seems to me that children's books, especially as you're working on them, you write them and illustrate them in combinations. It seems to me that actually is maintaining like a common value system in a way that we don't see that in the culture so much at the moment. Do you think of it that way, or is it?
I absolutely do. I mean, it's one thing. I do a lot of things. I write for adults. I write essays. I do theater, and I do fine arts, and I love all of these things. Following what I think is the most useful for some of the work I want to do in the world.
Right.
What I find is important, especially about children's literature, is that it's one of the few literatures that's made of connection. It's one of the few literatures that's communal. Reading as a general practice is something that's done very solitarily, except when you think of books for young people, and you read that with a community, you read it to a classroom or with each other. And I think that level of desire for connection is something that I think is important and real. And I think, especially when you think of it in terms of time, children live in the present. That's what they do. They are present tense beings.
Right.
And it is up to us who have a little more history, a little more time behind us or under our belts, to create the connective tissue for their ideas, for their hearts, for their heads.
Yeah, no, I think I read somewhere in a piece you wrote, I think for the New York Times, that reading is all about recognizing yourself in something.
Right, and I very much believe in the old adage that, like, I am human, nothing that is human is foreign to me.
I've seen in your writing that you can be very, academic and analytical, and you can also, in children's books, be very poetic and simple. And can you talk about moving between those different voices? It's maybe about sort of thinking about who your audience is for.
Absolutely. I mean,
situation.
There's a phrase that I borrow from identity politics, code switching. They talk about, but I think that it's often misused and misthought of. We speak differently to mothers than fathers. I speak differently to my cousins, who still call me and say, "Yo, Chris, man, you still reading them books?" They mean it generally, books, I read a lot of theory, but I still read novels, and I still, I'm working on a theater piece right now, or two, or four, or depending. I am also interested in the switching between languages, and that's a gift. And I think that I want to embrace that gift as much as possible.
In a moment in world history where it feels, perhaps as it's felt before in other decades or centuries, that the world's coming to an end, are the children still this sort of,
do I believe?
Optimism?
Do I believe that children are the future?
Yes.
Young people have so much less anxiety around their own hybrid natures than any adult does, and I think that beyond everything else does give me a lot of hope. I spend a lot of time working in juvenile detention centers. These are young people that really don't have any access to resources, but what you see in these juvenile detention centers are young people who, when faced with the plethora of ideas and selfhoods that they can choose in this modernist conundrum of being, they choose all of them. And I love that. They are gender-wise, race-wise, culture-wise, so open. And that's a gift that I think will serve to shape our future.
Christopher Myers won a Caldecott Honor in 1998 for his illustrations in the book Harlem. and a Coretta Scott King Award in 2016 for illustrating Firebird with Misty Copeland. Recent exhibitions of his work were at Fort Gansevoort Gallery in New York City and the Mistake Room in Los Angeles.
Summer Wheat is an artist from Oklahoma now living in New York. Her tapestry-like paintings, inspired by a range of influences from Native American art to folk quilts to post-impressionist painters, depict scenes of agrarian life where women play central roles.
It is sort of a torture having the name,
yes.
So
We're getting this question over with.
And pretty much the introduction to all conversations or all meetings that I encounter begin with going through a conversation about my name. And so usually, actually, surprisingly, people don't bring up the microbrew question, but I know that it is a beer.
Because if you Google you, that's all you find.
Yeah, that's a beer. It's surprising that that doesn't come up more, but the conversation always is the sort of initial way in which I acquaint myself with people.
And do you have a standard line or a joke or something?
I'm so numb to it because I've had the name obviously all my life, and so I've had this response in this conversation several times a day. So when I call to pay a bill or I have to do some kind of weird transactional,
Your name, leads with this, but do you feel some eccentricity coming from the Midwest in some ways? Exotic maybe in New York City?
I very much feel like different than others, just having this background of being from Oklahoma, yes.
Well, let's use those stereotypes of the Midwesterner, I'm a Midwesterner too, onto the subject matter in your work, which is, kind of agrarian, and it's very much, I think of it as kind of like Mesopotamia, like this kind of the breadbasket of the world, or the beginning of civilization. You have a kind of ancient subject matter in your paintings. Is that something you've always dealt with?
Part of that has to do with, I think, just this innate sort of dialogue visually that I've had since I was a kid and started drawing and painting. And the only art references I had growing up until I was 18 or 19 were Native American images.
You're from Oklahoma City.
I'm from Oklahoma City. So it was way before we had the internet and things like that and different resources. So my art classrooms had Native American books, and the art magazines that we looked at were of Southwestern artists. And so everything that I was referencing in my drawings as a kid were Navajo blankets or scenes from those images. So I didn't even realize that there was this other Western art history until I was 18 or 19.
Yeah, and I suppose it's in art school that you finally realize that craft, versus sort of easel painting or something, becomes something associated with women's work or domesticity or something like that. Yeah,
I think it's a thread, no pun intended,
yes.
that's sort of surfacing at the moment, or has been for a few years, and it sort of started for me because I always tried to take that part of my dialogue out of my artistry and when I was in my 20s and early 30s, because I was divorcing myself from that language to sort of try and understand the other side of it. And for me, one of the biggest influential moments was seeing a show of the Giesbin quilts in 2005, just because they were these extremely large-scale abstract works that were operating like paintings, but they were in fact blankets that had been used. They had cigarette burns on them, they were made from denim, and they were these invented abstractions that were not coming from a place that was registered in art history or Western art history. They were just emotive. And so that day at the museum, I went to another side of the space and I saw these Jonathan Laskers and Peter Halley and geometric abstraction. That was from an academia and like very rigorous from a different standpoint. And I just felt interested in how different yet the same those two worlds were operating, and I felt like I could reestablish the dialogue that I had been using, growing up, and sort of integrate it with what I had learned.
Yeah. So talk about the technique you use. It's something very distinctive. It looks like tapestry. The paintings look like tapestries, but you have invented a technique, essentially, right?
All of my paintings are arrived at from my drawings, and everything that comes out of my studio is really from the core of my drawings that have been there all along, and just trying to find a way to make a line sculptural and finding a way to bridge the gap between painting, sculpture, and drawing. But aside from that, I was also really interested in building a point of reference to de Kooning and Seurat in one place. And so those little dots, or the way that the paintings are made, and almost like a pixelation kind of...
In a scientific
kind of mapped out way, are like pointillism, but they're also like made with this very muddy, physical paint. Like I mix like 5-gallon buckets of paint. So the physicality of the paint and then the way that they're pushed through the screen, it kind of gratifies both of those sensibilities that I need when I'm working.
It's kind of about the imperfections of the system, right? I mean, it shows a kind of human touch, but it shows maybe an aspiration to something that's more systematic, more rational.
They're like engineered in some ways, and they've taken me to a more rational place than I ever thought I would be with painting.
They seem to hit a good balance, though, because I think there's some chance in it, right? I mean, describe the process itself. You push the paint through a screen, right? And so it ends up globbing on the other side.
It's from this interest of wanting to look at paint and wanting to make a painting from all sides. So I'm really working them from behind and in the front. So it's like I kind of am going back and forth between the back and the front of the paintings.
You've replaced certain male roles, like hunting roles, in some cases with women, right?
I started getting interested in that just going to a place in history or in visual history looking for unknown artists or like ancient artists making things, and really sort of finding parallels between the ways in which ancient art was made and the Native American references that I was very versed in. And I found like this kind of connection to them and just an interest in the sense of humor that's employed by a lot of those ancient works and the characterizations of the figures. And then I just started noticing how the gender roles were very much assigned and have been assigned throughout art history. Like depending on where you look, like there tends to be male hunters and women in the kitchen, or women as these sexual objects. And so I just thought about like reassigning those roles or changing them in a way so that we would start to see, you know, maybe these female figures, like they need to be re-registered in our psyche.
I don't know social history well enough to actually know what I'm about to say, but it seems to me that that probably women did things that they didn't get credit for a lot throughout history. They probably did hunt. They probably did fish. They probably did, you know, a lot of things that men only get credit for in those depictions.
I feel like women have been laboriously working through and been behind, you know, the outside of the spotlight, doing all of this labor this whole time. Thankless labor. And
with your body.
Exactly. And there are so many people who are completely, you know, unrecognized for the contribution that they're making in our world in terms of their labor. And it's just such a, you know, it's another point of that, you know, dialogue and trying to bring about that idea. Yeah,
I mean, there's a dignity to it. I mean, growing things, tending animals. I mean, all of the basic sustenance comes from that kind of physical activity. I mean, now it's been industrialized in some ways, but I think we still honor, in theory, in an idealistic way, that kind of thing. Farms have been kind of idealized, but I think in some ways, like, it hasn't caught on in the larger culture that that's valuable work.
It's not something people tend to think about, at least not maybe in the art world.
No, I mean, well, I'm glad we're doing it here.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think that the practice of shamanism and things like that that's happening in the, especially like in the Native American circles, those paintings were mandalas. Those paintings were meditative ways to reach certain places in spirituality. And so I think that just by looking at them, people know that there's something behind them that was from that plane, from a spiritual plane. And so I think we are searching for something, some type of mercy, some type of...
Some sort of relief from just like stained glass in medieval cathedrals is both a story, it's something that illiterate people could read, but it was also something that changed with the light. You know, as the sun went down, you saw the whole thing darken almost realistically, you know, as it would in a landscape.
I actually did a project in 2018 at Smackmelon in Brooklyn, and I was invited to create a show or installation in the space, like, I think the day after Trump was inaugurated. And so I was like, okay, I have to do something, because in a year from now, we are really gonna need a place to go to that will quiet our minds. And I was thinking about Egyptians would make these walled off garden premises that would protect themselves from the outer climates. And so I was thinking about how we will need protection from like a political climate at that time. And so the show I used these paintings to put into the windows that were like faux stained glass works that were creating an interior garden. So I wanted to have like a place where you could reflect on your interior self. I hope that when you experience a work, you might feel different after seeing it. So that to me is really what I'm after, is that it might do something for you. Maybe it lasts, maybe it doesn't, but just that the purpose is that you feel somehow different.
Summer Wheat's show at Smackmelon Brooklyn closed April 2018. Her recent gallery shows at Andrew Edlin Gallery, New York, and Shulamit Nazari in Los Angeles were met with critical acclaim.